legal reason was not to try and basically right the wrongs of our society. It was not meant to try to help people who had faced systemic discrimination. The point was to help all of us by creating more racially diverse student bodies. And I think a lot of people don't realize that about affirmative action programs. It was supposed to, again, benefit white students, Hispanic students, Asian American students, Black students. So if that's your perspective, then that help is no longer there. Now, for other people, they feel affirmative action programs have hurt Caucasian applicants, have hurt Asian American applicants, and that those applicants will be helped by the ending of affirmative action. We know from prior experiences in states like California that ending affirmative action tends to dramatically decrease the number of Black and Hispanic students in certain colleges and universities.
Yeah, I think, Jessica, you set it up perfectly. Depends on your point of view, because some people will be cheering this decision. Other people will be heartbroken by the news today. Let's bring in senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Ed, have you heard any reaction from the White House yet? I know this is just breaking now.
It is, Gail. We have been told to anticipate some kind of a reaction, but that the White House, its lawyers, and the president would want to read through the ruling first before really weighing in. He's got some time before he heads to some events in New York around midday where we might hear from him either on paper or in person. One thing to consider, though, when it comes to the issue of affirmative action more broadly, we recently did some polling on this, Gail, and it found that 53% of Americans believe that affirmative action broadly should be continued. About 47% said it should not. But on the question of race-based college admissions, look at this, just 30% think colleges should be allowed to consider race in college admissions. 70% think they should not. So it's not that the court is necessarily taking its cues from public opinion. It says it never does that. But it does show here that the ruling today reflects broad public opinion. And that is something that, obviously will be considered in the political space. But the Biden administration had argued that in the case of Harvard's admissions process, they didn't believe it was in violation of the 14th Amendment, that the policies should be allowed to stand, and that the court should allow the university to continue doing so. Obviously, they've run counter to that today, and will await a formal response from the president and his administration as to what exactly it believes. One other thing to call out here, in the ruling itself, towards the bottom of the Chief Justice's opinion, he writes in part, quote, "Nothing prohibits universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected the applicant's life, so long as that discussion is concretely tied to a quality of character or unique ability that the particular applicant can contribute to the university." We had anticipated there might be something like this that would say you can talk about it in your college essay, or it can be taken as part of a broad spectrum of reasons why you should be admitted. But the idea that a university is going to look explicitly at one's race alongside other factors is what the court today is saying is not allowed.
That sentence you just read is very interesting inclusion in this ruling today. When you look at the big picture, how do you think this will impact the number or percentage of minorities who get accepted into universities? When you look at it on its face, you think, how can this possibly not affect Black and brown students here?
Yeah, look, there is some evidence that in recent years, as college admissions processes regarding race changed, there was a lower number of minority applicants accepted. Perhaps that is inevitable. And so that's obviously where a lot of proponents of what UNC and Harvard were doing are going to be concerned, that this could adversely affect the admission of Black, Latino, Asian American students. But the other thing to remember here is back in 2003, then Justice Sandra Day O'Connor had warned that given the way society was changing and given the contours of affirmative action, she believed that at some point in the next 25 years, this ability for colleges to consider race so explicitly was going to get struck down. Now, almost 20 years later, it appears that has happened.
Thank you very much, Ed. Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett, we're going to go back to him outside the U.S. Supreme Court. I wonder if we could follow up on what Ed was just saying.
Yes.
Major, I read recently between 6 or 7 students who had decided 6 or 7 states, rather, who had eliminated accepting students based on race, that there had been a significant increase in the acceptance of Black and brown students.
Right. Let's go over the specifics on this, Gail, because this was argued before the Supreme Court. It was part of the briefs the courts considered. 8 states in the United States, and I'll list them off to you: California, Florida, Michigan, Nebraska, Arizona, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, and Idaho have banned using race as a factor in college admissions. California was the first. It did that by referendum. What has been California's lived experience since then? And this was briefed to the court. In the UC system, University of California system, its most selective schools, it saw a 50% drop almost immediately in admissions for Black and Latino students. And the University of California system has tried to figure out a way to increase those numbers after taking race out of the consideration process. It has been unable to find a formula, a holistic formula, a non-formulaic formula. That's some of the terminology presented to the court to raise those numbers. So it had an immediate effect, and it has not rebounded since. And that is something that was briefed to the court, that there are real-world examples where if you take race out of the equation in any way, shape, or form, it is very hard to reach these goals of diversity that colleges, either private or public, have set for themselves. And as I mentioned earlier, and this has become a part of the conversation, it's going to be an ongoing part of the conversation, students coming to college want a more diverse campus body to go into. Their parents oftentimes prize that. How do you get there? What are the methodologies? That's going to be something colleges now are going to have to work out. And the experience in California is instructive. And those who represent and speak on behalf of African American and Latino students say it gets ever more harder once you take race out of the consideration process entirely. Well, that may be the result for those states in the country, unlike the 8 that have already banned it, that haven't done so now, because they're going to be reconciling those difficulties and the challenges presented by creating a diverse student body on college campuses without taking, at any shape or form, race into consideration. Gail?
Major, thank you very, very much. It'll be interesting to see how going forward universities will make an effort to remain diverse. This is such a very important question that really affects all of us. Thank you. Once again, breaking news: the Supreme Court ends affirmative action in college admissions. Our coverage will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and of course tonight on the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Gail King, here in New York.
All right, if you're just joining us, we are following breaking news this morning. The Supreme Court has just issued a major ruling on affirmative action. In a 6-3 decision, the justices ruled that the consideration of race in college admissions is unconstitutional. Let's bring in Evan Kamenecker. He's a former dean and former constitutional law professor at the University of Michigan. Let's also, are we bringing in Ed? Not yet. All right, let's talk to Evan first. All right, so Evan, let me ask you. If you're just following along with the special report, and even before the special report, we were having a discussion about this. So help me understand something. If a university chooses to, for example, admit students that are legacies, in other words, they have parents or both parents who went to that university and also donate to that university. I'm specifically thinking about Harvard University, which some reports suggest 43% of applicants to Harvard admissions are white legacy students. 75% of those, according to the reports, would not have been admitted if their parents were not wealthy or donors or alumni to the university.
Applicants or they get in?
Sorry?
You said applicants. You mean the applicants or the people that actually get in?
43% of Harvard admissions. People who get in. 43% of Harvard admissions are white legacy students. 75% of those would have been rejected if their parents were not wealthy or alumni to Harvard University. Could someone bring a case before the Supreme Court and say that is unconstitutional?
No. And the reason is because the statutes or the Constitution don't speak to discrimination on grounds like that. The Constitution speaks to discrimination with respect to race, with respect to sex, color, religion, national origin. But it would basically say that institutions could take into account legacy or money or things like that, as long as they have a rational basis for doing so. Now, that doesn't mean it's a good idea. And increasingly, universities, particularly private universities, have either reduced or stopped the practice of taking legacy into account. And to some extent, it is because they think that it has had a negative impact on racial diversity. But that doesn't mean it is nonsensical to do. It's nice for a university to have people who feel comfortable there, who feel excited to be there. And I suspect that some universities at least, will continue to choose to do so.
Can we talk a little bit about the dissent? The counter argument. I know that Justice Sotomayor, when she was listening to the arguments, she was questioning whether or not race. She was talking about the fact that race, in fact, does have an impact on your options if you grow up in this country. Other countries too, where we're talking about this country. That, in fact, African American kids often end up in schools where there are fewer resources, where perhaps some of the teachers aren't trained as much. And to ignore that is detrimental and is dishonest in a way. Can we talk about what the dissent sort of played out, or what the dissent had to say?
Sure. Well, a couple things. I actually am quite intimately aware of the conditions in the Detroit public city schools, for example. Recently was involved in a lawsuit there that showed that the schools were essentially schools in name only. You had buildings that were falling apart, no air conditioning, no heating that worked, vermin that had to be scurried out or cleaned up after in the morning. As you say, shortage of teachers, shortage of accredited teachers, no homework that could be given to the students because they don't have enough textbooks to go around, and they had no access to laptops. So students do whatever work they can do in school, and there's no homework that can be done. Now, obviously, when you have lots of urban areas in our country that tend to be minority dominant, that tend to have schools that are less well preparing them less well for higher education, it's not a surprise that they don't have the same opportunity to show their accomplishments, to do well on test scores, to wow their students with great essays, to do all the kinds of things that normally you have to do to present yourself well on in a college admissions application. But I'll say something more generally. One of the things that the Supreme Court majority focuses on is the negative impacts that it claims come from affirmative action, basically talking about the idea that for every minority student who gets in, or in your earlier question, for every legacy student, I guess, who gets in, somebody's not admitted. And I think it's important to understand that many, many more people feel aggrieved by affirmative action programs than actually are. So there may be a university that, for example, because of affirmative action, let's say 500 additional students get in who might not have otherwise, but 30,000 applicants who were denied might all feel that they were left out because of affirmative action. I talk to my students about driving around a crowded parking lot, and you keep going and going, and all the spots are taken except one that's reserved for service vehicles. And you think, dude, if that were not reserved, I'd be parked and I'd be shopping by now. But there's 100 cars circling, and all 100 drivers think they're the ones who are being disadvantaged because the one spot is reserved. In reality, only one of you are. And that may also be.
So I was going to say, that reminds me of the previous case that came up, and you probably have a better memory than me, but it was a young woman that was at the center of it, I think probably funded by the same group or a similar group. But at the end of the day, her claim that she was detrimentally impacted by affirmative action was rejected because she really didn't have the grades.
Yeah, and that's something that we see, and it'll be interesting to see. I don't cover education, but I know, for example, that the state of California has done away with affirmative action in the California university school system. They've had that in place since 1996, or they have taken it away, done away with it since 1996. It would be interesting to see what the results have been in the UC system. Professor, just stand by for a moment, because I want to bring in our senior White House and political correspondent, Ed O'Keefe, who is joining us from the White House. So, Ed, sort of broadly speaking here, this latest decision by the Supreme Court, with its conservative tilt, is again indicative of this sort of upending of decades of sort of established jurisprudence that's sort of redefining, I think, in 2023, in the last couple of years, our American life on a series of contentious issues like, for example, this one, and before it, Roe versus Wade.
Yeah. As we mentioned a little while ago during the special report, I think it's important to remember that there were conservative justices 20 years ago foreseeing today. Sandra Day O'Connor at the time, writing in a similar case that dealt with affirmative action in colleges, saying there may come a day when this court ultimately determines, based on how society is going, and yes, because of the balance of the court, that this is no longer going to be allowed, and that is essentially what they're doing today. And again, it eliminates race as a factor alongside your scores and a handful of other things. But what the court says in its opinion is that it can be included amid a mix of other things, as if it were part of the interview process or an essay that's submitted that talks about some challenge you overcame in your life. And so it's not going to be eliminated entirely. It's just not going to be able to be weighted as equally as other things and as explicitly, because those that were pushing for this change have argued because of that process, there were Asian American students especially who they believe suffered and were denied admission to Harvard and the University of North Carolina and other institutions because they were using such a system. And again, it's important to point out, California, the place that most Americans would consider the bluest, the most liberal state of them all, rejected a referendum on this issue, a few years ago. And across that state, they said it wasn't necessarily necessary. And why wasn't it necessary? Well, there's evidence that among Hispanic, Asian, and black voters in that state, that they don't necessarily support it at all, the idea of race-based college admissions or the need for it, because increasingly those students are able to get into university based on the merits, based on their scores, based on the fact that their families have gotten to a point economically and socially where they can get into college. That's not to say writ large that's the case, but you're starting to see the change in part because those minority communities that programs like this were once intended to help are arguing increasingly, maybe not a majority of them, but enough of it is showing that the numbers are changing in such a way that perhaps, hey, maybe we don't need that anymore to help us because we can do it on the merits. Perhaps that's where the court is trying to steer the country. That's an abrupt change. It's not going to sit well with many Americans. But in our own polling, 53% of Americans support affirmative action broadly. 70% in a recent CBS News poll said they oppose the use of race-based college admissions. So in essence, society or the country is to some extent with the court. Again, that's affirmative action overall. 53% believe it should be continued, 47% abolished. But on the specific question of race-based college admissions, there you go. And this is the partisan breakdown. 75% of Americans think it should be, or Democrats should be continued. Notably, only 47% of independents and 30% of Republicans think affirmative action should be continued. If we have the next slide on race-based college admissions, it's 70% don't think it should be allowed, 30% think it should be. You break that down, partisan differences exist but aren't overly dramatic. Republicans are widely opposed, and they're joined in that view by more than half of Democrats and by 3 out of 4 independents. Black Americans relatively more likely than white Americans to say colleges should be allowed to consider race, but still just split on it. College graduates are slightly likelier than people without college degrees to say so too. So, and then there's this important question. How much discrimination exists today? Notice the smaller numbers there as you go though. 48% of black people say there is a lot, 28% of Hispanics, quarter of Asians, 17% of white people. So, thinking on this is changing and maybe changing in ways that people may not realize. Supreme Court doesn't take its cues from public opinion, but certainly, as you said, Vlad, this is a change in the ideological makeup of the court. That change, the 6-3 majority that conservatives enjoy, thanks to the Trump administration, certainly now being reflected in what has been for so long an explosive issue, race-based college admissions, how exactly affirmative action should be used to help advance people into higher education.
All right, Ed, stand by because we want to bring in CBS News Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett for a little more analysis. Major is actually right in front of the Supreme Court. My question to you, Major, is does this stop at college admissions? Does this decision have implications beyond that in the workplace and perhaps beyond?
So based on my initial reading, and I want to qualify that very specifically, my initial reading of this decision, it is not a broad constitutional argument against affirmative action outside of the college admissions process. There have been some who have been fearful that the court might go beyond the question presented about college admissions based on my initial reading, and it's a very long opinion, so it will take some more time, and I will absolutely defer to constitutional law experts on this question, but I don't, in my initial reading, see this as a decision that has any impact beyond college admissions. That is not to suggest, however, that impacting college admissions is a minor issue in this country. It is not. Colleges grapple with this question all the time. And what the court essentially said, Anne-Marie, is if you use race, then you are using race as a marker to make a set of assumptions. And that set of assumptions benefits some and possibly harms others. And the way to solve that problem, the court majority said, is to eliminate it entirely. In the words of Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the decision, eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. In this sphere, Judge Roberts and the majority of the court are saying, colleges, you can figure this out. There are other ways to get to this, but if you are using race in your consideration process, you by definition are assigning a set of assumptions to one question, race. And those assumptions help some, hurt others, and the way to solve that problem is to take that out of the equation entirely. So what could colleges do? They could look at zip codes, they could look at household income, they could look at legacy status. Look, if colleges, particularly elite universities, public or private, stopped giving preference to those whose parents had attended previously or were big donors, that would open up a lot of admission slots. Will colleges be willing to do that? That would be an enormous leap. It might be an enormous leap in the direction of diversity, but it would be outside of the question of race. And what the court is saying is there are ways to figure this out if you so desire. But picking up on Ed's point from a moment ago, he mentioned California.
Right.
The University of California system, after, by referendum, California voters decided to end race as a consideration in admissions at their most selective University of California schools, they saw admissions of Black and Latino students drop by almost 50% overnight, virtually, within the first 2 years. And they have, through lots of means, tried to re-increase those numbers, get them back to where they were before race was taken out of the consideration process. They have not found a way to do that. So this is hard work, and it's the hard work now that colleges and universities across this country, with the result of this decision, are going to have to undertake.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, Major, because I know in California they have implemented all these sort of outreach kind of programs to go into communities and encourage more applicants. But it's, you know, kind of when you get to the point where you're applying for, you know, a place at a college, that's the final step on this journey. I mean, before that, it's about, you know, proper funding of schools. It's about proper access. It's about all these other things that this decision doesn't really kind of address.
And if I could, Anne-Marie, Sonia Sotomayor speaks to this in her dissent. At one point, she says this decision by the majority creates a superficial, these are her words, I quote, superficial rule of colorblindness in an endemically segregated society. Justice Sotomayor, who, like Justice Thomas herself, both of them were products, they have said themselves, of affirmative action in their college admissions process. And though both benefited from it, both have diametrically opposed positions on what it means and what it meant to them. For Justice Clarence Thomas, he believed arriving at Yale, stigmatized him because he thought many of his fellow law students thought he was only there because of his race, not because of his underlying qualifications and justifications academically to be at Yale. And that always, he said, burdened him in Yale and burdened him in his life after law school. Sonia Sotomayor looks at this more holistically and says, in our history, constitutionally and other laws, we have discriminated against people of color in this country, and that discrimination has kept them out of places like colleges and kept them out of places where you can generate generational wealth. And that history has to be taken into account when you think about the real world lived experience in our past and how to redress that in the future. Diametrically different positions on the same issue for two justices who both benefited from affirmative action.
Yeah, though I don't know if Justice Thomas would agree with you on that conclusion that he benefited from affirmative action, but certainly Sotomayor has said, look, I had lower standardized scores than some of my other classmates, but I was capable.
Well, I mean, Justice Thomas said, yes, I got into Yale not because I wasn't qualified, but because they had a program by which they looked and sought after students of my kind. So he acknowledges that was in part how he got into Yale. But what he says, the stigma that he carried with it then and for the rest of his career burned in him this sense that this is a, on its face, unfair application because it creates a notion. It creates a set of assumptions, which is one of the things the court gets at here. And during oral arguments on these two cases, Justice Thomas kept asking, what's the definition of diversity? Can you give me a definition of what that word means? Because I know what the Constitution means. I know what equal protection means. I know what race consciousness means. You define diversity for me. And because he did not, and the majority of the court did not receive, to its satisfaction, a definition of diversity, what it means, what its value is, and why the state should go out of its way to allow it to continue, they said no. Because those are vague and imprecise, we were going to go with the precise language of the 14th Amendment. They understood, to their minds, application of the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. You're going to say you're going to treat everyone equally by taking this out of that equation.
Yeah.
All right, major robust discussion there. Stand by while we bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian, who's following this from Washington, D.C. for us. Nicole, what are you hearing?
Well, we are seeing a lot of reaction from both sides of the aisle. Most notably, you have a lot of Democrats that are decrying this position. Just a short time ago, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer released a statement saying that this is a giant roadblock and, of course, blasting the decision, saying that this will impact the admissions process for the next cycle of students. You also have Delaware Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester, who's also running for a U.S. Senate, who said that she was at a loss for words and that this decision by the Supreme Court to, in her words, a gut affirmative action is wrong, plain and simple. On the flip side of the aisle, you have many Republicans who are praising this decision, calling it a welcome victory. For instance, you have Congresswoman Virginia Foxx, who is on the House Committee for Education and Workforce, and she calls this, again, a welcome victory for countless students across the country. Other Republicans also weighing in, praising this decision, as well as some 2024 candidates, from former President Donald Trump to former Vice President Mike Pence, who has said there is no place for discrimination. You also have Vivek Ramaswamy, a Republican primary candidate, who says that he is glad that the Supreme Court has laid to rest the worst failed experiment in American history. So right now, a lot of this reaction seems to be right along party lines, and we know this will continue to be a politically charged debate as folks continue to react to this decision.
Indeed, Nicole, thank you so much. And we are going to continue to get reaction and analysis of this decision. We're also waiting for some more decisions coming down from the Supreme Court. Perhaps the next big one is the Supreme Court weighing in on President Biden's plan to forgive student loans. That is what he campaigned on. And so whether or not the court rules in his favor will be huge. We're going to take a break for now.
It's a history-making meeting. 4 extraordinary women who are all 4-star generals and admirals.
How did you deal with being discriminated against?
I just worked harder.
The future of an ever-evolving U.S. military when we go person to person.
Stories start with the who, what, when, and where. CBS News has been following this story. Camilla, why is the government relying on these devices to track migrants? But it's why it's important to you that matters most. Doctor, why are federal health advisors focusing on this specific pill for contraception? And knowing what to ask is how you open the door to a deeper understanding. I'm John Dickerson. See you on Prime Time, streaming free everywhere.
Stories that inform.
You can be really old at 60, and you can be really young at 85.
Inspire.
How do we unlock the power within ourselves to be who we want to be?
And brighten your day.
The best part of fame is making people feel good. Always send the people home happy.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
an original documentary from CBS reports.
He started out as a fun-loving party boy, but the alcohol got the better of him. What I envisioned was him being in some sort of medical facility. I just thought, what a great candidate for them to learn about the results of alcoholism and what it does to a body. But his body was sold to the military, specifically used as a crash test dummy in a simulated Humvee explosion. I was devastated. I had the box. I don't know if they were his ashes or not. I just held it as tight as I could, and I just told him how sorry I was.
Body Brokers, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Hey there, welcome to The Uplift. I look over at him and he's smiling.
I'm going to remember that the rest of my life.
It's really a miracle that he's with us today.
The Uplift, stream now on the free CBS News app.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education.
Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need.
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
On CBS News streaming.
Welcome to America Decides, Monday through Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern.
After nearly 4 decades of March Madness, this sports broadcasting legend is stepping away from his role in covering the NCAA basketball tournament. Jim Nantz on his fondest memories and what's next when we go person to person.
We're following some breaking news this morning. The Supreme Court has just issued a major ruling on affirmative action. In a 6-3 decision, the justices ruled that the consideration of race in college admissions is unconstitutional. We want to bring in Derek Johnson now. He's the president and the CEO of the NAACP. Derek, thanks so much for joining us. I know it's going to be a very busy day for you. Let me just ask you for your reaction on this decision.
It is an unfortunate day for America that this court would decide that diversity has no value. The worst thing about affirmative action is it created Clarence Thomas. He would not be serving on the Supreme Court but for affirmative action. We are a nation who should celebrate diversity, who should recognize the harms of the past. Institutions, corporations, and other entities were not able to apply a diverse opportunity for so many individuals. Affirmative actions created a pathway, and this court's decision is a chilling effect on the future of diverse settings for African Americans and other individuals moving forward. It is unfortunate that we are here today.
So we have a little bit of an example of what could happen, right? Because we know in California, and I believe also Michigan, they have banned the use of affirmative action when it comes to admissions. In California, they're still struggling to get those numbers back up.
And that's the reality that we're confronted with. Here you have many individuals who were born and grew up in zip codes that denied quality K through 12 funding and education, who was somehow able to still overcome that, be situated to get to institution of higher learnings, and now the doors are closed. That should not be the way for America. Are we going to be a country that embraces diversity for a global economy looking into the future, or are we going to be a country that's always looking to try to remake 1950s? And the 1950s is not a workable solution for this nation, and this is a Supreme Court that's looking to create that apartheid reality, and we should not stand for it. It is the responsibilities of corporations, it's the responsibilities of institutions of higher learnings to figure out, now that they're in the wilderness, what they must do to ensure diversity, because in diversity is growth. If we don't have diverse settings, this country cannot grow into a future that's competitive with other nations.
So, Derek, let me ask you what others who don't share that opinion have said, which is that we celebrate diversity in this country, but these these laws that have been put into place over the course of many, many years have then prejudiced the acceptance of the admissions of other students, for example, Asian Americans, or even some white Americans who say, look, just on the basis of my merit alone, I deserve a seat at that university, but because of these laws, I am now disenfranchised. So thus the equal protection under the law that the 14th Amendment affords all Americans is not being applied to me. I'm being disadvantaged by this. How do you respond to people who say that?
Let's be clear, merit has not been the primary factor why individuals are able to advance in the way they have done. Individuals are advancing because of legacy emissions. Individuals are advancing because of wealth and the creation of wealth in the zip code that they was born into. Individuals are advancing because of a level of white privilege that you, I, and all of us here have been denied. So those arguments fall flat. And a few decades of trying to affirmatively repair the intentional harm based on race that took place for centuries is inadequate to address the necessity of providing opportunities. So this is not a merit conversation because Clarence Thomas would be on the Supreme Court. We have far more African Americans, much more qualified in their academic settings and their performance than he was. He's there because of affirmative action. So the merit argument falls flat on its face.
And then what about the other argument that we heard is that race can no longer be a shortcut to make assumptions about the life that someone has lived, the challenges that they have faced, that in fact, you know, we have very wealthy African Americans and Hispanics and so on and so forth. And so you cannot assume that the individual based on their race would need assistance to get into a certain school.
But that's our point exactly. White people should not use race as a need to get into schools. They should not use the white race category to advance themselves. So let's remove that as their accelerator and open up opportunities for more individuals of diverse backgrounds. That's our argument. But we fail to recognize for the centuries that race and gender, because white males have had a leg up because of their gender, because of their race, and been able to get in seats that they were not qualified for because there were other individuals who were more qualified. And affirmative action was to remedy that. It is a solution to a long-standing problem. It isn't the problem.
Yeah, and Derek, just to echo what you are saying, let me just read for our audience a bit of what Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson has written. Having so detached itself from this country's actual past and present experiences, the court has now been lured into interfering with the crucial work that UNC and other institutions of higher learning are doing to solve America's real-world problems. Going on with the dissent, no one benefits from ignorance, although formal race-linked legal barriers are gone. Race still matters to the lived experience of all Americans in innumerable ways, and today's ruling makes things worse, not better. The best that can be said of the majority's perspective is that it proceeds ostrich-like from the hope that preventing consideration of race will end racism.
Absolutely brilliant dissent. And it captures the essence of the history of this country and why affirmative action programs are so crucial to create opportunities, diversity, and to allow this nation to move into a future of inclusion as opposed to an exclusionary past. She personifies the essence of academic excellence and an outstanding jurist. But the real question here is, for the majority of the court, what type of America are they trying to create? Are they truly trying to create an apartheid reality in the United States? We've lived that experience. It is a diminishing return, and there is nothing we can do to go back there. So it's important for institutions of higher learning. It's important for corporations and other employers to do all what is possible to ensure diversity in their spaces in order for this nation to live up to its creed, in order for this nation to have a functioning democracy.
I want to ask you about, while we have you here, I want to ask you about the other big pending case. It has to do with President Biden's loan forgiveness program and whether or not the court will allow him to proceed or not. I just want to talk a little bit about the impact if the court decides that this is unconstitutional or it can't move forward. Because when we talk about Black and Hispanic borrowers, okay, so my producer's talking to me now, and we're running out of time. So hopefully we can keep you, because I want to talk about that with you as well, okay? Thank you, Derek. All right, we're going to take a quick break, I presume? All right. So as you heard, we are awaiting the decision from the court on President Biden's loan forgiveness program, student loan forgiveness program. And when that comes up, of course, we will discuss it with you. For now, we're going to take a bit of a break.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
At the CBS Evening News, we focus on solutions. We look at a story and we say, how do we make it relevant to people's lives?
So this is what we eat to live longer.
Finding solutions to help people understand what are the right choices to make for you and your family.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
Morning news matters because it sets the tone for your day, and it's a way of getting you started.
We take you places, teach you new things, and we make you feel like, it's not all bad. We're going to uplift you.
People say to me, you always seem to be having a good time. I mean, you know what? You're right.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
You had a substitute teacher that was pretty popular. What was his reputation?
Everyone loved him.
You had to miss a test. What did he offer to have you make up the test?
He said that I can come by after school was all over and just take the exam. The blinds were down. He closed the door. The next thing I knew, he was right next to me. That's when I realized what was going to happen. Even if I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs, no one would hear me because no one was there. He told me that if I ever said anything to anyone, he would kill me and he would kill my family. So I did it.
Pledge of Silence, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She was near the finish line of the Boston Marathon when a terrorist bomb changed everything. Join us for an extraordinary story of survival, persistence, and triumph when we go person to person.
When weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging wind.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
We're really excited that we've been honored with the Emmy Award for Outstanding Live News Program. But we know we couldn't have done that without you. So thank you. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7 on CBS.
We go to stories because we can bring someone to that story. That human connection is incredibly important. The news doesn't have to be depressing.
What do you love about running?
It can be uplifting.
CBS News. Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan, Sunday on CBS.
After the tragic loss of beloved newsman Tim Russert, his son went on a worldwide journey to find himself.
I struggled with his grief for a long time.
How Luke Russert is honoring the legacy of his father when we go person to person.
It's just about 11 a.m. in Washington. The Supreme Court issued a major ruling on affirmative action in the 6-3 decision. The justices ruled that the consideration of race in college admissions is unconstitutional. We want to bring in CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson, CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe, and NAACP President Derek Johnson. Derek, let me go to you first. I know we just spoke about this in the last hour, but for viewers who are just joining us now at the top of the hour, your reaction to the Supreme Court decision ruling against affirmative action.
But the Supreme Court has failed America. It is unfortunate that we are not embracing diversity and opening up opportunities. For the centuries of harm directed, state-sponsored, against African Americans, a few decades of a program that was not perfect should not be eliminated. The worst thing about affirmative action is that it created Clarence Thomas. So this is a sad day for the future of this nation, and corporations, institutions of higher learners must do all that they can to ensure diversity in their spaces.
Jessica, I want to just go to you and get you to kind of break down the decision of the court and the dissent.
So a majority of the court here, as expected, struck down the University of North Carolina and Harvard's policies that explicitly use race as a factor in admissions and said that both violate the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. And Anne-Marie, I think this is something that you and I talked about after oral arguments, which is there's one view, and this is the majority view, that the Equal Protection Clause says no discrimination on the basis of race. And that means essentially don't take race into account because that is discrimination. Another view, and that's the view by the dissent, is no invidious discrimination, meaning that equality, the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, it says that you cannot deny any person equal protection under the law, that equality can allow private actors and in the government, in the case of the University of North Carolina, to take race into account because things like racial diversity in a student body is a compelling government interest. It's something that is good for everybody. I think what's really interesting for people to note when they think about affirmative action is that, legally speaking, the justification has not been to help people who have been subject to systemic racism and systemic problems. Legally, the justification is it's good for all of us to have students who are in a racially diverse class. And that's what we really lose today, in my view.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to point out, that it was never about sort of righting the wrongs of the past or anything along those lines. It's because a diverse student body is a great environment to learn in. Can you sort of flesh out the dissent for us?
Right. So what the dissent was saying is that the Equal Protection Clause does not bar consideration of race. The Equal Protection Clause bars, again, invidious discrimination. So we make distinctions all the time. The government draws lines all the time. And what the dissent is saying here is, and I think Justice Jackson has this line, this let them eat cake approach, this blindness to what our society really looks like is a problem. So I'm going to point out two things about the dissent. One is they legally take on the majority and say, that's not my reading of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment allows us to take race into consideration to get to that compelling governmental interest of racial diversity. But the other thing that the dissents do, and we heard this in the oral arguments, is that they talk about the practicalities of this. What happens outside the courtroom? We know what happens is that the number of Black and Latino and Latina students drops. I'm talking to you from California. We've banned affirmative action for years. We know what happens. And in that case, we know that colleges and universities are a pipeline to society. So we're not just talking about colleges and universities, we're also talking about a ripple effect. And that's something the dissents bring up, and they talked about in oral arguments as well.
So beyond that ripple effect, though, does this decision have implications outside of school admissions?
So as I read as quickly as possible, not explicitly, but certainly we're going to look at this rationale, and I'm sure that it will be taken into other arenas.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jessica. We're going to pivot back to Derek. And actually, Derek, I'm going to ask you about the other case that I never got a chance to ask you about, that we haven't gotten a decision on, President Biden's loan forgiveness program. The court is going to be looking at a couple of things, whether or not those who have come forward, a couple of individuals in a few states, even have legal standing, but then whether or not this can be done, whether or not the president can forgive loans or whether that should be in the domain of Congress. But I want to ask you about what will happen if this student loan forgiveness program doesn't go forward, because we know that Black and Hispanic students share a tremendous burden when it comes to loans, student loans.
So let's set the table here. The reason why you had so many individuals borrowing money to go to colleges and university is because states across the country, in lieu of cutting taxes for the most wealthiest individuals and corporations in those states, they increased tuition. Mm-hmm. And as a result of increasing tuition, Congress did not increase Pell Grant. So the cost of going to school went up over the last 20, 30 years. During the exact same time, you have more Blacks and Latinos attending schools, particularly Black and Latino women. And so we enter into this space of having a predatory financial reality for individuals who were simply trying to advance in life through education. We should not be funding education on the backs of working poor individuals. And so what the Biden administration did was to try to give some relief for those individuals as a result of student loan debt is a super debt. You cannot discharge it in bankruptcy. Unlike the former president who filed multiple bankruptcies, the student loan debt, had he had any, would have remained a part of his liability. That's unfortunate, that's unfair, and we must give people a ladder up. If the Supreme Court rejects this administration's ability to forgive upwards of $20,000, this administration must do all they can to alleviate that financial pressure from individuals who simply were trying to progress in life through education.
Derek Johnson, President and CEO of NAACP, thank you so much. Appreciate your time. I want to pivot over to Ed O'Keefe now, because I know Ed has been getting reaction to the Supreme Court decision about affirmative action. I've apologized to the viewers as we sort of ping pong between these two cases, but I know that you've been getting reaction. What are you hearing?
Well, first of all, you may be wondering, what does the president think of all this, and when won't we hear from him? We don't have official word on when that will come. We know that in this White House, packed with lawyers, that's an understatement, they are reading through this decision quickly to try to determine what exactly it says, not only in the specific challenge to these two college admissions cases, but to society writ large. To your question, Anne Marie, about how will this affect the rest of society, that's one of the things that lawyers here at the White House are looking through before the president says anything more, whether that's in writing or in person. We'll keep you updated on that. He's headed to New York later today, so it is likely to happen before he leaves the White House on his way to New York for campaign events. There are some interesting statements coming in from various political leaders who have strong opinions on this. I want to call out a very interesting one from former First Lady Michelle Obama, who we hear from so infrequently since she's left the White House on really any matter. But you remember that the story of Michelle Obama begins on the south side of Chicago, involves her going to Princeton to study sociology and African American studies, and then on to Harvard Law School. She is an African American woman who, went to the Ivy League and has surely benefited from superior higher education. So she writes in a lengthy statement today, in part. Before we get to that part that we see there, I want to call out another part. She says, of course, students on the campuses she went to and countless others across the country were and continue to be granted special consideration for admissions. She says some have parents who graduated from the same school. Others have families who can afford coaches to help them run faster or hit a ball harder. Others go to high schools with lavish resources for tutors and extensive standardized test prep that help them score higher on college entrance exams. We don't usually question if those students belong, she says. So often we just accept that money, power, and privilege are perfectly justifiable forms of affirmative action, while kids growing up like I did are expected to compete when the ground is anything but level. She goes on to say, today is a reminder, or today, my heart breaks for any young person out there who's wondering what their future holds and what kinds of chances will be open to them. And while I know the strength and grit that lies inside kids who have always had to sweat a little more to climb the same ladders, I hope and I pray that the rest of us are willing to sweat a little too. Today's a reminder that we've got to do the work not just to enact policies that reflect our values of equity and fairness, but to truly make those values real in all of our schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods. Notably then, Former President Obama, in a much shorter statement, says in part, like any policy, affirmative action wasn't perfect, but it allowed generations of students like Michelle and me to prove we belonged. Now it's up to all of us to give young people the opportunities they deserve and help students everywhere benefit from new perspectives. So that is a notably, strongly worded reaction from Michelle Obama, who clearly has an opinion on this and has expressed opinions on so little else in the years since she left the White House. Clearly this one today hitting a nerve, especially given her own life experiences and how she benefited from higher education. But there are others in the political space who've weighed in on this. Just a little while ago, the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell speaking on behalf of many Republicans, saying in part that the decision, quote, is a, quote, long overdue step towards ensuring equal protection under the law. For decades, the court turned a blind eye as higher education prioritized illegal social engineering over merit. Today's rulings make clear that colleges may not continue discriminating against bright and ambitious students based on the color of their skin. Most Americans agree that racial discrimination should play no part in the college admissions process. Now that the court has reaffirmed that common sense position, students can get a fair shot at college and the American dream on their merits. The Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley also weighing in, saying the world admires America because we value freedom and opportunity. SCOTUS reaffirmed those values today. Picking winners and losers based on race is fundamentally wrong. And we should point out more broadly, CBS News has polled on the question of affirmative action and race-based college admissions. 53% of Americans in the CBS poll support continuing affirmative action as a policy. But just 30% of Americans in our recent CBS poll believe that colleges and universities should be allowed to use race as a consideration in admissions. So public opinion today, at least, reflected in that Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court doesn't account for public opinion, or at least it says it doesn't. But it is important to point out that, at least in our recent polling, most Americans agree with what the court did today.
All right, we're thanking everyone. Ed O'Keefe, Jessica Levinson already gone, Derek Johnson already gone, but thank you so much. We're going to continue to follow this story for you, as well as other breaking news, so stick around.
It's a history-making meeting. 4 extraordinary women who are all 4-star generals and admirals.
How did you deal with being discriminated against?
I just worked harder.
The future of an ever-evolving U.S. military when we go person to person.
Stories start with the who, what, when, and where. CBS News has been following this story. Camilla, why is the government relying on these devices to track migrants? But it's why it's important to you that matters most. Doctor, why are federal health advisors focusing on this specific pill for contraception? And knowing what to ask is how you open the door to a deeper understanding. I'm John Dickerson. See you on Prime Time, streaming free everywhere.
Stories that inform.
You can be really old at 60, and you can be really young at 85.
Inspire.
How do we unlock the power within ourselves to be who we want to be?
And brighten your day.
The best part of fame is making people feel good. Always send the people home happy.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
He started out as a fun-loving party boy, but the alcohol got the better of him. What I envisioned was him being in some sort of medical facility. I just thought, what a great candidate for them to learn about the results of alcoholism and what it does to a body. But his body was sold to the military, specifically used as a crash test dummy in a simulated Humvee explosion. I was devastated. I had the box. I don't know if they were his ashes or not. I just held it as tight as I could, and I just told him how sorry I was.
Body Brokers, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Hey there, welcome to The Uplift.
I look over at him and he's smiling.
I'm going to remember that the rest of my life.
It's really a miracle that he's with us today.
The Uplift, stream now on the free CBS News app.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education. Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need.
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
On CBS News streaming.
Welcome to America Decides, Monday through Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern.
After nearly 4 decades of March Madness, this sports broadcasting legend is stepping away from his role in covering the NCAA basketball tournament. Jim Nantz on his fondest memories and what's next when we go person to person.
Travel troubles continue for passengers at airports across the country this morning. There have been more than 35,000 delays and 7,000 cancellations since Saturday, frustrating people either traveling on business or simply trying to start their vacations. Meanwhile, Delta officials reported an emergency landing in Charlotte, North Carolina yesterday after a plane malfunctioned and forced passengers to be evacuated. Chris Van Cleve has more on all of this from Phoenix. Chris, good morning.
Good morning, Anne-Marie. Certainly some scary moments for folks in Charlotte as that plane with its landing gear issue. More on that in a moment. For most people that were flying yesterday, it wasn't an emergency in the skies. It was